And our next presenter for the morning is Judith Lindbergh. Judith is a writer whose new novel, Admiral, is about a nomad woman warrior on the ancient Central Asian steppes. Her debut novel, The Thrall's Tale, was about three women in the first Viking Age settlement in Greenland. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, some of which include Newsweek, Libby Magazine, Writer's Digest, Archaeology Magazine, and Up Here, The North at the Center of the World, published by University of Washington Press. Judith has spoken at and published with the Smithsonian Institution and provided expert commentary in two documentary series for the History Channel. Judith received a 2024 fellowship from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, and she is the founder and director of the Writers Circle, a creative writing center based in New Jersey. And please join me to welcoming Judith today with her presentation, From Bones to Breath, Turning Archaeology into Authentic Historical Fiction. Welcome, Judith.
Hello, thank you. Can everybody hear me? I am going to start a screen share to show you a little bit about the work that I've been doing and to tell you a little bit about how indeed I have turned ancient history and archaeology into fiction. So here we go. I'm very excited to share with you my thoughts on the topic because I have been working with archaeology as a key aspect to my historical fiction and the research behind it for many, many years. My first novel is The Thrall's Tale, and there's an artifact that literally created one of the key characters in my first novel. And so you never know as a creative writer what will inspire you to discover a piece of the past that you want to bring to life on the page. So Akmaral is about a nomad woman warrior on the Central Asian steppes in the 5th century BCE. It's literary historical fiction, so it is not just sort of a fun romp. It's a pretty serious novel about this ancient period of time. Akmaral is descended from the Amazons, the same women warriors who fought in the Trojan War and battled heroes like Theseus, Achilles, and Heracles. But what happened to them after that? According to Herodotus's Histories, Book 4, they did not disappear entirely. After the Trojan War, the defeated Amazons were shipped home across the Black Sea. They hijacked the ship, as Amazon women would, and threw all the men overboard. They drifted for a while because apparently Amazons didn't know how to sail until they crashed on the cliffs of Lake Maeotis in what is today the disputed Crimean Peninsula. They captured some wild horses and rode off across the steppes only to encounter a band of Scythian warriors. The Scythian men were determined to fight until they realized that their enemies were women. As often happens in these ancient Greek tales, battle turned to courtship, and before long the two bands were living quite happily together. But while the Scythians wanted to stay with their magnificent new lovers, the Amazons refused to live as Scythian women would, without the freedom to hunt, battle, and roam at will. So they agreed to ride off together to the east and became a new tribe, the Sauramatai. This is the origin story for my character, Akmaral's clan. They are a matriarchal culture of horseback riding herders descended directly from the Amazons and their Scythian mates. Herodotus provides some of the only documentary evidence of these ancient people. The Scythians themselves left virtually no written records. So while this fascinating narrative provides a backbone for my character's past, it simply isn't enough to have discovered who the Sauramatai might have been and what their lives were like. The real inspiration for my novel came to me almost entirely from archaeology that proves that these ancient women warriors were real. First, let's take a look at this extraordinary landscape over 3,000 miles from ancient Greece. At the time of my story, Akmaral and her people live in this high mountain pasture called the Ukok Plateau in the Altai Mountains of Central Asia, a place that contemporary residents call the pasture of heaven. And if you ask me, I see why. Here, the wind bristles across deep green pastures ringed by high, rugged mountains. Golden eagles wing overhead, and somewhere in the snow-capped peaks, snow leopards make their dens. Each of these creatures figures prominently in my novel. They're intimates of a culture and people who lived on these pastures 2,500 years ago. Here is a map to give you a sense of the scope and scale of where my novel takes place, from the Ukraine all the way in the west, pretty close to where the Trojan War was fought, all the way across the steppes to Kazakhstan, Mongolia, northwestern China, and southern Siberia. And right here is where the Ukok Plateau is. Here are some modern borders to give you a little bit of your bearings. And you'll see that red pin right here in southern Siberia. Something extraordinary was discovered there that became the first true spark for my novel. It was found in a kurgan mound, a large burial chamber, one of countless mounds that dot the Central Asian steppes. One particular mound was discovered in 1995 near the village of Pazyryk on the Ukok Plateau. And here is what was found within. This is the Siberian Ice Maiden, who was found perfectly preserved in the permafrost. She was buried with a feast of horse meat and mutton. Rich grave goods, including gold amulets, bronze mirror, and beautifully appliqued felt cloths, were buried with her. She wore an elaborate headdress that was so tall that her larch wood coffin was 8 feet long to accommodate it. And you'll notice here is the Ukok Plateau, and there are no trees, so you've got to wonder what kind of effort was made to bring these logs up into this region. Here is a reconstruction of her burial, and you'll also see 6 horses that were sacrificed in her honor. Now, if you think of a horse as a Tesla, you understand the kind of extraordinary sacrifice that this must have been for her people. Now, the Siberian Ice Maiden's body was so well preserved that even her skin survived. And as you see, it was covered by intricate animal-style tattoos, including the iconic flying deer image on her left shoulder, which also now graces my novel, which made me very happy. Because of her pristine condition, the scientists at the time were able to test her DNA, and they discovered that she was of Caucasian origin, essentially from Europe, which connected her directly to the Amazons of myth. Here is a modern inspired tattoo based on the flying deer image, and a sketch of the image where you can see it more clearly. And these decorative flourishes on the deer's antlers are interpreted as mythical griffins. So this image is a composite and believed to be a spiritual representation rather than one of a literal creature. This image in my novel becomes a critical spiritual symbol for Akmaral's people, and especially for Akmaral's own journey through her life. Now, her tattoos and artifacts were made in the Scythian animal style, which is common across the entire Scythian sphere of influence. From gold plaques to stone carvings to finely wrought weaponry, the images almost always feature wild, straining beasts, often attacking their prey. Here we have twisted and coiled felines. This is a griffin, again a griffin, attacking a yak, and this is some kind of a horned lion attacking a horse. Here we see a reconstruction of what the Ice Maiden might have looked like based on her remains, and on her shoulder, of course, is the flying deer. Now, the Siberian Ice Maiden was certainly enough fuel for thought to get me going on my writing. But it was not the only burial that ultimately inspired my character, Akmaral. There was a second burial that gave me a much clearer idea of who these descendants of the Amazons might have been. This is the Izhik gold man, found in Kazakhstan in the 1960s. He was buried with a vest covered with gold arrow-shaped plaques, and his belt has more amulets made in the Scythian animal style. He was also buried, as you see, with a sword and a dagger. And since this was the 1960s and DNA testing had not been invented yet, the archaeologists and scientists of the time simply assumed he had weapons. He must have been a man. But later scholars took another look at the artifacts, the burial stature, some of the other grave goods, and particularly the tall decorative headdress, which echoes the Siberian Ice Maiden's headdress, but even more relevantly, it's very similar to what modern brides wear on their wedding days in the region to this day, which made these later researchers question whether the gold man might in fact have been a woman. Unfortunately, there is not enough DNA remaining for us to ever know for sure. But since that time, countless burials have been discovered all across the Central Asian steppes of women killed in battle. Their bodies bear the wounds of war, and their graves contain all kinds of weaponry, arrowheads, spear tips, daggers, and swords, as well as feminine effects. So with the Siberian Ice Maiden, the Izhik Gold Man, and all of these extraordinary new discoveries, I was able to create a character, Akmaral, who begins her life, as all her people must, as a warrior defending her people, and eventually grows into an important spiritual leader for her entire community. Now, artifacts are fantastic, and I find them fascinating, but they aren't enough to create a living, breathing culture as you would want in an engaging novel. So to draw the full scope and scale of their daily lives, I turn to modern cultures and traditions in the Central Asian region, especially to horseback archery that has been practiced in Central Asia for millennia. As you'll see in this somewhat low quality but still impressive video, the horse and the bow give women equal footing in battle as men, and modern people still practice these traditions. If you consider that Akmaral's time in around 500 BCE is several hundred years before the invention of the stirrup, you'll also realize that this kind of riding would have been even more difficult at that time. It required that the rider hold onto the horse with the sheer strength of their legs. This rich cultural heritage of traditional skills like horseback riding, archery, horse racing, and wrestling all feature in my novel, but are drawn directly from the practices and celebrations held today in Central Asia at festivals like Nadam, the Olympic-style annual event in Mongolia. There are, in fact, petroglyphs found across Central Asia that show that these ancient traditions go all the way back to prehistory, and that many of the cultural traditions of the nomadic people that we celebrate in the modern day were represented thousands of years ago. Modern nomad people in the region still migrate with their herds, live in yurts, and place their children on horseback even before they can walk, as this little girl represents. And this young blonde girl on the upper right corner is a child that was identified and then tested to compare her DNA with the Caucasian Ice Maiden. And there is a direct genetic connection between the two through the generations, which shows the modern people of Mongolia are direct descendants from a combination of European and Eastern integration. Now, the horseback riding was so critical to these ancient peoples that you'll see evidence of their lifestyle reflected in their bones. These two skeletons from the Scythian period are clearly laid to rest as if they are still riding on horseback. And if you look carefully, their thigh bones are bowed from years of riding. Not only that, but the finger bones on many of the finds are contorted and deformed from repeatedly shooting arrows. You'll also notice this round bronze object with a handle under the skeleton's shoulder. It's a bronze mirror, and a similar one was found in the Ice Maiden's burial chamber. Bronze mirrors in this time were not necessarily objects of vanity, but seemed to indicate that the deceased was some kind of a spiritual leader or perhaps a shaman. This particular mirror is etched with the same iconic shapes of the flying deer. In my novel, it becomes the possession of an important shamaness who guides Akmarel to her destiny. And these are deer stones, stone stelae that are scattered across the steppes, particularly found in Mongolia, which also bear the image of the flying deer. These stone pillars date to the Bronze Age and to an earlier culture, but provide another definitive connection between the Caucasian Ice Maiden, whose perhaps Scythian ancestors hailed from the west, and the spirituality of an earlier tribe who left their mark on the region. Here is a closer look at one of the deer stones alongside two other artifacts, one gold and the other bronze, that reflect this spiritual symbol's continued importance throughout the Scythian sphere. Now, Herodotus wrote that the Amazons lived without men, but archaeology tells a different story. Most Kurgan mounds burials contained both men and women, sometimes as warriors and sometimes not. In fact, there is one very interesting burial where a man was laid to rest with a child in his arms. In many of the burials, women were the most prominent central figure in the mound, which indicates that they were leaders. Priestesses, warriors, chieftains, we're never really sure. So it draws some attention on the possibility of very non-traditional gender roles in this ancient culture. But one particular passage from Herodotus really made me think and gave me the key to a core conflict in my novel. Regarding the Amazons, he wrote, "It is their custom that no maiden weds until she has killed in battle, and some grow old and die unmarried because they cannot satisfy this need." This passage started me thinking about what it would have been like to live in a culture like this, where the imperative and responsibility for everyone, men and women both, was to protect, which also meant to kill. Unlike so many women in historical fiction and in history, these descendants of the Amazons do not appear to have been outliers fighting against social norms to find their power and strength. These women apparently had equal responsibility implicitly and from the start, including in military might and leadership. What would it have been like to be a woman like this who never had to question her value? This was an exciting opportunity for me as a novelist to defy the social constructs of modern historical fiction, which is a funny phrase, and try to imagine a world where women were equals and didn't have to question themselves. But what if you were born in this world and killing was not your desire or even your nature? What if you were a woman like me? Answering these conflicting questions provided the key for me to explore Akmarel's world and her personal journey. Why does fiction matter in our efforts to preserve and promote the study of the ancient world? Deeply researched historical fiction offers both the lay reader and the scholar an opportunity to leap into the past and relive ancient history on the page. Fiction intrigues and invites curiosity and conversation about the topics that scholarship in ancient history presents. I can't tell you the number of people who've told me when they read my books that they have gone on a deep dive to learn more about the topics that I shared with them in my fiction. And isn't that what we want more people to do? While fiction is not scholarship, but rather an imagined interpretation of the facts, serious novelists are steadfast and diligent in respecting the research that they base their works on. Akmaral is neither the Siberian Ice Maiden, nor the Issyk Goldman, nor any of the other burials that I studied. She's an invention grown from the backdrop of archaeology, history, culture, landscapes, and beliefs, all gleaned from the hard work of scholars and historians. Although we can never truly know what these ancient peoples were like, fiction provides a fascinating way to engage with the historical and prehistorical past and to bring them to life for the broader audience and as a point of entry into deeper study. I hope that you find this idea of fiction about your fascinating worlds fascinating, and maybe we'll pick up a copy of Akmaral. And I would love to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith, for a wonderful presentation. I'm excited to check out your new book, and I will have to say, I remember years ago, the Siberian Woman in Ice was featured in a National Geographic magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And then, my parents were moving homes. They threw out my magazines and I could never find it again. So I'm glad to have that information now.
If you look on the Nova transcripts from back, it's still out there. You can read all the transcript from the original Nova documentary, which is part of what got me started reading it and working on this book a long time ago.
Mm. So in the chat, we do have some questions for you. Let's see. So the first is a comment and a question. So history gives a great, rich source of material for writing fiction, and it's really great to see how much authenticity you try to bring to your characters. It's always hard because you're looking at it from the context of what we know and understand today.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do anything defensively in your writing or with the character development to preserve it as relevant if we learn new things in the future?
That's a great question because, in fact, I can't remember, 2 or 3 years ago, and this book was already in production, they discovered that the Ice Maiden died of cancer, of advanced breast cancer, and also of a terrible fall toward the end of her life. And those aspects were not included in my interpretation. So I have an extensive historical notes at the end of the novel and acknowledge as many sources as I possibly can and the time frame that I used to do the research. And when I do my book talks, I like to share that it's an evolving understanding and that this is the moment and the world that I see it as I understand the research at this time. And I love when new possibilities come up. It actually creates a whole new story in my head, although I'm not sure I'm going to do another book about the same basic characters. It's a good question.
Oh, sequels are always fun, just in case you want to do a short sequel.
It's crossed my mind.
And then regarding the shamanist integration with the coin,
Mm-hmm.
do you write their faith as having an explicit impact on causality, or do you try to keep it more open-ended?
Their faith is evolved from a combination of animism and shamanism, which I interpreted both from the plaques and the animal style imagery and the petroglyphs and so on, and also with the shamanism that is practiced in the region today. And there's a lot of different variations. It is in my novel, there are 2 priestesses. One is the Akkam, the white priestess, who is the sanctioned priestess of the tribe, and one is the Karakam, who is the black priestess, the one who is shunned because she connects to the deeper nature of her spiritualism and reaches into the dangerous realms of that spirituality. So when we talk about causality, it is all around them at all times. They deeply are connected to their relationship with nature, they survive with nature and with the elements in a day-to-day life and death sort of way. And their practices and beliefs act as protections, perceived protections, but in some instances where really rich, complicated parts of the plot where the Akmaral and the characters are going through really significant challenges, that depth of the dark beliefs or the more powerful spiritual beliefs do sort of propel in a gentle way as a kind of sense of guidance and as an opening to a potential path for the characters. But I ultimately don't want to suggest that the mystical aspects make things happen. It's not a magical reality. It's more of a relationship and a perception of how the natural forces affect the characters rather than, if we make a spell and some kind of shamanistic ritual, magic things happen. That's not how this book works.
All right. I think that's all for questions that we have in the chat today. Well, thank you so much, Judith, for joining us at the conference today. And I look forward to reading your book.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. Have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.